It's been 30 days since the 21st of January, and the snow hasn't stopped falling since then. It keeps piling up, flurrying down from the heavens like a relentless blizzard. Outside, you feel like you could get buried alive just walking. When this all began, no one seemed to think much of it. It was just another winter storm, after all. It started in the Midwest, in a small town in North Dakota, but I don't think that meant anything to people who weren't meteorologists or climatologists. The storm began expanding very rapidly. I'm not sure if it's still growing, since the power has been out for more than 4 weeks, but it certainly hasn't moved at all. Things started looking more peculiar when the wind failed to shift the storm. It just kept pounding the central states, expanding east towards Illinois and Indiana, reaching my small town of Gary, Indiana. The weather forecasts changed every hour as forecasters revised their estimates, going from saying there would be a light dusting to a few inches to predicting a catastrophic snowstorm. My husband, John, couldn't heed that warning though. He had to go to work, and I had to stay home to care for our 3-year-old son, Daniel. When John walked out that morning, I promised him I would keep Daniel safe. Watching John pull out of the driveway in his old Ford pickup, I had no idea it would be the last time I'd see him. As the day wore on, the weather took a turn for the worse. The forecasters were right, predicting one of the worst storms the Midwest had seen in over a century. It amazed me when the power stayed on late into the night, but I wasn't complaining. You never realize how bad a blackout is until you go through one with a 3-year-old who's terrified of the dark. Not that I can say I'm not scared of the dark myself. The last time we saw the smiling forecasters on the local news, they were saying the storm had expanded south into Kentucky and that we could receive up to 3 feet of snow overnight. It was about 7:45 p.m., I think. Less than a minute later, the news cut off, and every channel changed to an emergency broadcast, telling everyone to stay indoors and avoid all travel. I tried to reach John's workplace on my phone, but the lines were down. I didn't know what was happening, but I decided to listen to the reporters on TV and keep Daniel inside. I struggled with the idea that I shouldn't just desert John, who worked a town over, but when I looked outside, I realized I couldn't risk going there. To the north, across the horizon, the sky was an ominous gray, thick with swirling snow. The roads were eerily silent, but not as deserted as you might think. A lot of people were reluctant to leave their homes. They all seemed to be in shock. I watched from my window, seeing a few brave souls trying to shovel their driveways, but most just stood inside, peering out at the relentless snow. I still remember watching the snow pile higher and higher, burying cars and reaching the lower windows of houses. Daniel kept asking about his daddy, and I had to tell him that Daddy was at work and would be home soon. In truth, I had no idea if John was safe or not. All night I tried to find a radio station that could tell me what was going on. There was nothing but static, and an occasional emergency broadcast telling us to stay put. It seemed odd that I had seen very few emergency vehicles or any sign of the authorities. Now, looking back, I think they were probably overwhelmed or trapped themselves. The next day, things were worse. The temperature started dropping even further, and the snow turned to ice. The roads were impassable, covered in thick, treacherous ice. The clouds grew darker, and the wind picked up, howling like a chorus of angry spirits. The emergency broadcasts were going out to everyone across the region, telling us to brace for more severe weather. By nightfall, it was nearly impossible to distinguish day from night. Daniel started crying for his daddy, and I had to keep reassuring him that John was safe, even though I had no way of knowing for sure. I hoped that maybe he was somewhere nearby, safe in his truck, but deep down I feared the worst. We eventually had to retreat to the basement for warmth and safety. The wind was so fierce it felt like it might blow the house apart. There were strange noises outside, like something scraping against the walls and windows. Daniel kept waking up, scared of the ice monsters he believed were outside. I told him it was just the wind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. When morning came, the world was a frozen wasteland. The snow and ice had transformed our once familiar neighborhood into an alien landscape. Cars were buried, houses encased in ice. The sky was an endless expanse of gray, and the cold was so intense it felt like it could freeze your breath in midair. I knew we couldn't stay in the basement forever. We were running out of food and supplies. I bundled Daniel up in as many layers as I could find, and we ventured out into the icy wasteland, hoping to find help or at least some sign of life. The streets were empty, eerily silent. The snow crunched under our feet, and the cold bit into our skin. Everywhere, there were signs of people who had tried to leave. only to be trapped by the relentless storm. Abandoned cars, their windows frosted over, lined the roads. Houses stood silent, their doors and windows sealed by ice. We kept moving, driven by the need to find food and warmth. It was then that I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the distance, through the swirling snow, I saw a figure standing in the middle of the street. At first I thought it might be a person, but as I got closer I realized it was something else entirely. It was tall, impossibly tall, and wrapped in a cloak of ice and snow. Its eyes glowed a piercing blue, and its presence seemed to suck the warmth from the air around it. I could feel the cold radiating from it, like an Arctic wind. I grabbed Daniel and ducked behind a car, praying it hadn't seen us. We huddled there, shivering, as the figure moved past us, leaving a trail of frost in its wake. I waited until it was out of sight before I dared to move again. We eventually found a house that seemed abandoned. The door was slightly ajar, and the inside was dark and silent. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, pulling Daniel along with me. The house was cold, but at least it offered some shelter from the wind. We've been in that house ever since. At first we stayed in the living room, near the fireplace, but as the days and nights blurred together into one long dark ordeal, we moved to the basement for safety. Just in time, too. Soon after we went down to the basement, I heard something break through the front door and crash around in the upper part of the house, knocking over furniture and smashing windows. Time passed slowly, dragging on endlessly. The temperature outside kept dropping, until it felt like the world had plunged into an eternal winter. One night, I think, it's impossible to tell. The world outside grew so cold it felt like it could freeze your very soul. I can't say for sure how cold it was, but it was enough to make the walls of the basement frost over. A little bit of water started creeping into the basement through cracks in the walls, but it froze almost instantly, forming jagged ice crystals. That was the night I saw something I wish I could unsee. Daniel had fallen asleep early, exhausted and a little sick from the cold. For a while I let him sleep alone, choosing to look out through a small window where no ice had yet formed. At first I saw nothing but the pitch black of the night. Then, I noticed something out there in the darkness. A few faintly glowing patches of blue, moving through the snow. I watched them for a while, trying to understand what I was seeing. Then, there were several flashes of lightning, illuminating the landscape. What I saw was beyond comprehension. It was a colossal figure, towering above the trees, wrapped in a cloak of ice and snow. Its eyes glowed a piercing blue, and its presence seemed to freeze everything in its path. I could feel the cold emanating from it, even through the window. In its wake, there were frost-covered trees and frozen ground, leaving a trail of ice and snow. The lightning flashed again, and I saw more of the figures, moving through the storm. They were like giants, stalking through the frozen wasteland, their eyes glowing in the darkness. I watched them for a while, those images burned forever into my mind. Then I went back to sit with Daniel, holding him close, trying to keep him warm. When morning came, the world was a bit warmer. As the days wore on, the temperature rose slightly, but our supplies of food were dwindling. The owners of the house had left behind some canned goods and bottled water in the basement. It was enough to keep us going for a while, but I knew we couldn't stay there forever. One day I heard something outside. Voices, faint but unmistakable. I looked out the window and saw a group of people, bundled up against the cold, making their way through the snow. I grabbed Daniel and we hurried outside, waving to get their attention. They saw us and came over, their faces tired but hopeful. They told us they were part of a rescue team, searching for survivors. The storm had finally begun to subside and they were leading people to safety. We joined them, and as we walked away from the house I looked back one last time. The storm was finally over, but the memories of those dark days would stay with me forever. We walked for hours, through the snow and ice, until we reached a small town where the power was still on and there were supplies and warmth. The storm had left its mark, but we had survived. It's been a long journey, but we're safe now, and as I sit by the fire holding Daniel close, I know that we'll never forget what we've been through. The storm may have passed, but its memory will always linger, a reminder of the fragility of life and the strength of the human spirit. It's been 35 days since the 15th of March, and the tremors haven't ceased since then. They come in waves, shaking the ground like a giant's footsteps. Outside, you feel like the earth itself is unstable, ready to swallow you whole. When this all started, no one seemed too concerned. Earthquakes are not uncommon in California, after all. It began in the San Andreas Fault, just like many before it, but I don't think that meant much to people who weren't seismologists or geologists. The tremors started increasing in frequency and intensity, but I don't know if they're still escalating, since all power and communication have been out for over a month. What I do know is that they haven't stopped. Things started looking more dire when the tremors failed to subside. They just kept coming, hammering the state from north to south, stretching from San Francisco down to where I lived in Los Angeles. The emergency broadcasts changed every few minutes, with officials revising their estimates, going from saying that there would be mild aftershocks to predicting a series of devastating quakes. My wife, Lisa, couldn't heed the evacuation warnings, though. She had to go to the hospital where she worked as a nurse, and I had to stay home to take care of our 4-year-old son, Ethan. When Lisa left that morning, I promised her I would keep Ethan safe. Watching her drive away in her Honda Civic, I had no idea it would be the last time I'd see her. As the day wore on, the quakes became more violent. It looked like the seismologists were right, predicting one of the worst seismic events California had ever seen. It amazed me when the power stayed on late into the night, but I wasn't complaining. You never realize how bad a blackout is until you go through one with a 4-year-old who's scared of the dark and the ground shaking beneath him. Not that I can say I'm not scared of the dark and the tremors myself. The last time we saw the smiling newscasters on TV, they were saying the quakes had expanded south into Mexico, and that we could expect more violent shaking throughout the night. It was about 8:17 p.m., I think. Less than a minute later, the broadcasts cut off, and every channel switched to an emergency alert, telling everyone to get to open spaces and avoid being indoors. I tried to reach Lisa's hospital on my phone, but the lines were down. I didn't know what was happening, but I decided to listen to the reporters on TV and keep Ethan safe inside. I struggled with the idea that I shouldn't just desert Lisa, who worked in downtown LA, but when I stepped outside, I realized I couldn't risk going there. To the west, across the city skyline, the tall buildings were swaying dangerously, some already crumbling. The streets were chaotic, but not as crowded as you might think. A lot of people were too scared to leave their homes. They all seemed to be in shock. I drove my old Toyota through the suburbs, seeing a lot of people standing outside their houses, watching the horizon with fear, but encountering far fewer actually driving along the road. Some people were walking, clutching their belongings, looking for safety. I still remember driving through downtown LA, watching the skyscrapers shudder with each aftershock. Ethan kept clinging to his stuffed dinosaur, wide-eyed and silent, too scared to cry. I don't know what time it was, but I think it was close to midnight. All night, I drove through the city, trying to pick up a radio station that could tell me what was going on. There was nothing anywhere, though, except repeated emergency broadcasts telling everyone to find open spaces and avoid tall buildings. It seemed odd that I had seen very few police officers or emergency personnel. Now, looking back, I think they were probably overwhelmed or caught up in the chaos themselves. The next day, things were worse. The tremors started getting more erratic, and buildings were collapsing. The roads were cracked and buckled, making travel even more dangerous. The sky was filled with dust and debris, casting a grim shadow over the city. The radio was still urging people to evacuate if they could, but there was nowhere safe to go. By the time night fell again, it was hard to tell night from day. Ethan started asking me where his mother was, and I had to lie to him, telling him that Lisa was okay and that we'd see her soon. Really, I was lying to myself too. I thought that maybe she was somewhere safe in the hospital, but deep down, I feared the worst. We eventually had to pull over and find shelter. I chose a relatively intact house in a less crowded part of the city. We broke in, as gently as possible, and barricaded ourselves in a room on the ground floor. The windows and doors were still secure, but the walls were cracked. We've been in that house ever since. At first we stayed in the living room, but as the tremors continued, we moved to a sturdier room at the center of the house. It seemed safer. Just in time, too. Soon after we moved, I heard something crash through the front door and rattle the entire building. Tables were overturned, and the glass shattered. Time passed slowly, with the ground shaking intermittently. The tremors became a constant background noise. The temperature dropped and the air grew thicker with dust. One night or day, it was impossible to tell. The tremors grew so violent that I thought the entire house would collapse. I can't say for sure how intense the shaking was, but it felt like the ground was trying to tear itself apart. I held Ethan close, trying to protect him from falling debris. I could hear the groaning of the house as it strained against the seismic forces. That was the night I saw something that I wish I could forget. Ethan had finally fallen asleep, exhausted and scared. For a while I let him rest, choosing to look out through a small crack in the boarded-up window. At first I saw nothing but darkness and the occasional flicker of streetlights. Then I noticed something moving in the distance. Dark shapes, illuminated by the fires that had started in some parts of the city. I watched them for a while, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then there were several bright flashes of light from the fires, and I realized that what I was watching was not normal. The shapes were large, unnaturally so, moving through the rubble with an eerie fluidity. They were massive, hulking figures, covered in dust and debris, their eyes glowing faintly in the firelight. I could feel the ground tremble with each step they took. In their wake, buildings crumbled and the ground split open. The light from the fires fell away, but the glowing eyes continued. I kept watching for a while, those images burned forever into my mind. Then I went back to sit with Ethan, holding him close, trying to shield him from the reality outside. When morning came, the tremors were a bit milder. As the days wore on, the shaking grew less intense, but our supplies of food were running low. The owners of the house had left behind some canned goods and bottled water. It lasted us longer than I expected, but now we're almost out. I think Ethan and I are going to have to move on. If the roads are passable, we'll try to drive. If not, we'll walk. The city is in ruins, and the ground feels unstable. I don't know what's going to happen if the tremors start up again. I guess this part of California could sink into the earth. I'm leaving this note here, just in case someone finds it eventually. I just want there to be some record of Ethan, Lisa, and I passing through this world. I don't want us all to be just 3 more lost souls in the earthquake. I think I'm going to go insane. It's been 28 days since the 17th of December, and the rain hasn't faltered for a second since then. It keeps falling in sheets, driving down from the heavens like a waterfall. Outside, you feel like you could drown walking. When this all started out, I don't think that anyone thought much of it. I mean, this nightmare was just another winter storm then. It started in kind of an odd place, out in the North Atlantic across from the Gulf of St. Lawrence, but I'm not sure that meant anything to people who weren't meteorologists or oceanographers. The storm started out expanding very rapidly. I'm not sure if it's still growing or not, since the TV hasn't come on for more than 3 weeks, but it sure hasn't moved at all. Things started looking more bizarre when the wind failed to move the storm. It just kept hammering New England, growing south along the coastline from Maine all the way down to where I lived in Nassau County, just outside of New York City. The weather forecasts changed every few minutes as forecasters revised their estimates, going from saying that there would be light flurries to saying that there would be a few inches of snow to saying that there would be an absolute blizzard across the city, and that everyone should stay inside. My wife, Sarah, couldn't heed that warning, though. She had to go to work, and I had to stay home and take care of our 5-year-old daughter, Tanya. When my wife walked outside that morning, I promised her that I would keep Tanya safe. Watching Sarah pull out of the driveway in her Nissan Altima, I had no idea that would be the last time I would ever see her. As the day wore on, the weather took a turn for the worse. It looked like the weather forecasters were right, predicting one of the worst storms New York had seen in over a century. It amazed me when the power stayed on late into the night, but I wasn't complaining. You never know exactly how bad a blackout really is until you go through one with a 5-year-old who's still terrified of the dark. Not that I can say I'm not scared of the dark anymore, myself. The last time we saw the cheerful, smiling forecasters on the Weather Channel, they were saying that the storm had expanded south into New Jersey and that we could receive 2 feet of snow during the night. It was at about 6:23 p.m., I think. Less than a minute later, the Weather Channel cut off, and every program on the television changed to a warning, telling everyone to get out of New York City along whatever bridge they could take and avoid Manhattan Island. I tried to reach the company where Sarah worked on my phone, but the lines were down. I didn't really know what was going on, but I decided to listen to the reporters on my TV and get Tanya out of the city. I struggled with the idea that I shouldn't just desert Sarah, who worked in Manhattan, but when I got outside, I realized that I couldn't possibly risk going there. To the south, across the horizon, the dark clouds of night were painted red with flames. The traffic was horrible, but not as bad you might think. A lot of people were reluctant to leave. They all seemed to be in shock. I drove my Cadillac along the roads through Nassau and Queens, seeing a lot of people standing by the roadside watching the shadow of the flames flickering against the sky, but running into far fewer actually driving along the road. Some of the people were slowly making their way by foot out of the city, and as time went on, the traffic congestion got a bit worse, but amazingly I was able to get myself and Tanya out of New York before it became so bad that I couldn't drive at all. I still remember looking across the harbor on the road from Queens to the mainland and seeing Manhattan Island burning. I don't think that I'll ever forget that. Tanya kept staring out the window, speechless and tired too, I believe. I don't know for certain what time it happened to be, but I think it was past 11. All night, I drove through the countryside, trying to pick up a radio station that could tell me what was going on. There was nothing anywhere, though, except news of the mandatory evacuation of New York. It seemed odd to me that I had seen very few police officers and no military officials anywhere. Now, looking back, I think they were probably all either elsewhere or dead. The next day, things were worse. The weather started getting warmer, and the snow turned to rain. Piles of snow by the roadside were melting, and the blacktop was covered with water and mud. The clouds kept getting darker as the day went on, and we ran into more and more traffic, coming from places all along coastal New England. The radio evacuation order was going out then to everyone from Massachusetts south to New Jersey. By the time that night fell, it was pretty hard to tell night from day. Tanya started asking me where her mother was, and I had to lie to her and tell her that Sarah was okay. Really, I was lying to myself too. I thought that maybe she was somewhere along the highway right now, safely in her silver Altima. I have no doubts now that she was already dead. We eventually had to pull off of the road and go to sleep in our car. There were some strange sounds in the night around us, and my daughter kept waking up, scared that the monster she believed had been living under her bed in Nassau was there with us, living under the car. I told her that it was all just her imagination, but I couldn't help hearing the scratching on the undercarriage, or the occasional low purr coming from somewhere further out in the night. When morning came, everything seemed well again. That is, until I got moving. I wanted to believe that the sounds I had heard the night before, and the ever-present sense of something out there in the night had all been figments of my imagination, but what I saw along the roadside shook that pleasant notion from my head. Everywhere, there were cars still sitting on the roadside, their windows broken out, and their doors sometimes torn off of their hinges. In front of some, deep trails led through the melting snow into the distance. There was no way that I was going to stay out in the car that night. Instead, I chose to find a house along the road which looked empty, and well, I broke in. To be more accurate, I knocked on the door, and it creaked open on its own. No one was inside, so I decided that I and Tanya could stay in there for the night. The door locked safely and securely behind us, and we seemed to be safe. We've been in that house ever since. At first we stayed in the upper part of the house, but as the nights and the days grew together into one dark, pitch-black blur, we decided that the basement was probably safer. Just in time, too. Soon after we went down to the basement, I heard something break down the front door and crash around in the upper part of the building, toppling tables and knocking over the television. Time passed slowly, eternally dragging on. The temperature kept getting warmer and warmer, until it began to feel more like the middle of summer than the middle of summer than the middle of winter. Then, one night I think, it was impossible to tell, the world around us grew warmer than the inside of an oven. I can't say that the temperature was lower than 150 degrees. It was almost literally scalding. A little bit of water had started creeping into the basement through windows high up on the walls, and my daughter and I tried to stay out of it, because it was nearly hot enough to boil. That was the night I saw something I really wish that I could just unsee. My daughter went to sleep early. She was tired and, I think, a little sick. For a little while, I let her sleep alone, choosing to look out through one of the closed windows, where no water was pouring in. At first, I saw nothing but the pitch black of the storm. Then, I noticed something out there in the night. A few darkly glowing patches of luminescent green, coming from something I couldn't see. I watched them for a while as they bounced through the depthless darkness, moving along at a distance I couldn't really understand. Then there were several bright flashes of lightning, and I realized that what I was watching was much larger than anything I could have possibly imagined. How tall it was, I'm not totally sure, but I know it had to be bigger than a mountain. It was still just a shadow in the distance, but it had enough form for me to know that it was not normal, even in the twisted alternate version of reality which comes with the storm. I could feel the heat coming off of it and coming through the window like an open fire, less than an inch from my face. In its wake there were flames, spouting up from the forest of southern New York and casting black trails of smoke against the black sky. Soon, the light from the brief outburst of lightning strikes fell away, but the green glow continued. I kept watching for a while before going back to sit with Tanya. Those images burned forever into my mind. When morning came, the world was a bit cooler. As the next day wore on, and the next after it, the temperature went even lower, and so did our stocks of food. The owners of the house had a few weeks' worth of food in the basement. Apparently they were farmers who had kept old traditions of canning and drying their own produce. It lasted us longer than I thought, but now, we've been out for a while. I think that Tanya and I are going to head out. If the car works, we'll take it. If it doesn't, we'll figure something out. There's water everywhere, and it's more than foot deep on the flat land here. The ground reached its saturation point weeks ago, and the water hasn't had time to drain away fully. I don't know what's going to happen if it keeps raining. I guess this part of New York is going to join the Atlantic Ocean. I'm just thinking that maybe we can get to safety somewhere. There has to be some place where this storm hasn't reached. I'm leaving this note here, just in case someone finds it eventually. I just want there to be some remnant of Tanya, Sarah, and I passing through this world. I don't want us all to just be 3 more faces in the storm.